Welcome to the Ask Why podcast, a series of conversations exploring the future of learning and the future of work with experts ranging from professional educators to investors, company builders, and individual learners. The way we learn and the way we work is changing rapidly. Artificial intelligence is automating ever more tasks around us, putting pressure on all of us to reskill and upskill at accelerated rates, while dealing with a level of unprecedented information overload. The education system, built for an age of information scarcity and around a broadcast model of teachers and learners, is simply no longer fit for purpose. But what can be put in its place? If this is a topic you're interested in, I invite you to subscribe to our podcast by searching for #AskWhy in your favorite podcast app, or follow us on YouTube or TikTok and catch the video feed of these conversations, which are happening in VR. Today's guest is Katelyn Donnelly. Katelyn and I met in New York a bit over a year ago. She started her career as an analyst at McKinsey before setting up Pearson Ventures. Today, she's the managing director at Avalanche VC, focusing on startups that transform the way people learn, earn, and own. First of all, thanks for even taking the chat, taking the time to talk. It's I'm really looking forward to it. You have a pretty interesting trajectory to date. Of course, managing director at Avalanche, which is probably the biggest part of the conversation today in terms of everything we want to look at there. Do you want to provide some context on the chief of staff to co-founder at Pearson Ventures, maybe?
Sure. Well, maybe one of the things that ties it all together is I was at McKinsey for 3 years. In my third year, I saw this project on the pipeline to work with Sir Michael Barber to do a big reform program of the education system in Pakistan. And so I thought that project would be 2 months and I'd come back to San Francisco and work in tech. And I ended up staying for 8 and living in Lahore. And meanwhile, Michael Barber had been appointed chief education advisor at Pearson and asked if I'd be his chief of staff. So I left McKinsey and joined Michael as his first employee at Pearson. And I was Michael Barber's chief of staff for like a year and a half, helping him set up the office, begin to define his areas within Pearson. One of them was defining Pearson's efficacy strategy, so how they measure learning outcomes across their suite of products and services. And then the second was building a venture fund that would be able to work with companies that were both building efficacy into their products and services from the ground up and able to drive financial returns. So Michael and I were co-founders of that fund, and I was the managing director and he was the chair. And then the one thing that you missed in my bio was that Michael and I and a couple other people co-founded a company called Delivery Associates that works with governments to drive big reform programs. And we built that over the last 10 years and recently partnered with a private equity company. And I rolled off the board and the team to focus on Avalanche full time.
Oh, nice. Okay, well, that's a big step then. Big new focus. I mean, you've had the focus before, but I guess an extra focus on Avalanche now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like I'm able to kind of tie a bow on my chapter of consulting and being an operator of a primarily professional services firm to really focus on early stage startups and founders that are more product oriented.
Yeah. So before we start with the questions, I obviously there's been a lot of stuff around AI in the last month and a half. So I thought just to make it a little bit interesting, one of the questions that I prepared has been entirely written by ChatGPT. And at the end of the interview, I will ask you if you think you can identify which one of the questions was ChatGPT instead of me,
okay.
if that makes sense.
Cool. And these aren't the ones you've already sent me. This is a new one, I guess.
No, actually, I wonder. I think no. The ones that I have sent you were not, which narrows it down already. See, you're already trying to game it. But yes. So there's. I haven't sent you this question yet.
Cool.
So the questions I would like to start with, and I'm actually going to start with this question for everyone really to talk to, is really starting with what is one belief or one thing you think is true that most people in your field, in your industry, would disagree with?
Okay, yeah, I've thought about this, my answer to this. I always struggle with these questions because things are really obvious to me and I assume that other people believe them. And so it's hard to kind of, you're both trying to have self-awareness and then awareness of other people. But
Yeah.
when prepping for the interview, I thought that I'd answer this question with, I don't think that companies that resemble schools are venture backable businesses. So like boot camps, for example, or like new models of schooling. I think that like there is a place I think they should exist. I think they should be funded, but I do not think that they are venture backable technology businesses.
Interesting. And how far would you take that? Like, are you thinking about, is it the model of physical space? Is it the model of kind of broadcast type learning? Is it something else? Like, what would you say are those core components that are not venture
Like what's
backable?
a school?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
I think it's like so the reason I think what I mean are schools are not venture backable is that a school or like a set of curriculum is usually promising a certain type of student an outcome at the end, right? So like if I want to be an architect and I get like a master's in architecture, there's usually prerequisites to for that, right? So that means that only a certain number of people would be like truly qualified to go through the master's in architecture program to then be like a intermediate or advanced architect at the end. And so that means that like there are negative economies to scale because almost every additional student that you have is probably less of a good fit for that particular program once you go through a particular threshold because they might just like have not made the prerequisites, they might not be like as focused or like interested in the program. And so the first time you are able to kind of get that cohort, you can get an amazing group of people, but then the second cohort, or if you try to expand that
Yeah.
cohort from like 20 students to like 200 students to 2,000 students to 20,000 students, it just doesn't work because people aren't commodities in their learning journeys.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's like user acquisition doesn't scale in the same way, basically. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Very
Like we can all
interesting.
use Oculus and like be in this workspace, like every single human can, right? But not every
Yep.
single human is qualified to go through like a particular schooling program if you're
Yep.
doing it right.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Thanks. Um, and then the second question was, out of all the various learning experiences that you have gone through, so including schooling as well as say on the job training and things like that, what would you say was the standout or the best learning experience that you have personally gone through, and why was it that?
There are so many things I could answer in this question because I think, one of the reasons I've had the career journey that I've had is that I'm a voracious learner and always like to do new things and hate being bored. Um, but the one I was going to talk about was actually in university. My senior year, I was the president of the student union, and before that, I majored in economics, and I had my summer internship between junior and senior year at Morgan Stanley, and so I thought I was going to do sales and trading, and then my senior year, I was the president of the Duke University Union, which was the largest by budget value student organization on campus, and it was responsible for things like the coffee house, the radio station, the TV channel, putting on big concerts and events. And I was I was the CEO and I was able to restructure it and kind of like have all these people report to me. And so that made me think about being an operator and a leader instead of just an investor. And it was there that I like to say I made my first like angel investment or acquisition. So one of the students or one of my fellow students started a recording studio on campus, and I like recruited it or acquired it to be part of the student union, and we started the first student record label.
Oh wow.
And so I think at a young age, being able to like have a real, I mean, both a real but like a simulation of a role that then I could see myself in over time was really impactful for me.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. That must have been a really interesting experience.
Yeah.
Cool. So now we'll get into some of the questions that I haven't that I didn't
Oh.
send over before. And so the I'd love to spend a little bit more time talking about the piece you have you wrote, or whatever your thoughts are around alternative education, really. And before we do that, can I ask you how you would define alternative education? So this is actually close to what we were saying before, the schooling system. So maybe the answer is basically the opposite of what you said before. But like, just for the interest of everybody that will be listening to this, like, how would you define alternative education?
So the way it is defined out in the world is anything that is opposite of the mainstream education system, which would be your traditional state K through 12, or I guess in the UK you'd say primary and secondary school system, and then I think traditional 4-year university program. So that alternative education examples include homeschooling, religious schooling, tutoring, charter schools, um, any sort of like private school, really. So in the UK, you might like consider the ARC schools to be alternative education.
Perfect. And so what were the key observations, or what made you interested in particularly that space over everything else in learning right now? What were the key observations that made you think, okay, that's where the future lies?
Well, one of the things we look for at Avalanche is these inflection points. And so alternative education and homeschooling has been around for a long time, sort of like tale as old as time. And I think the question is, what is going to create that inflection point to make it go mainstream? And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is an acceleration of parents being frustrated by the like politicalization of the public school systems, and teachers as well being like leaving and getting frustrated. Like, so for example, in the US, the teaching contracts driven by the unions are still so traditional in terms of you're on this 30-year career and we pay you a little bit more each year, and then you get the tenure system, and after 3 years if you get tenure you basically are unfireable, and you don't get paid that much, but you have this like for life pension once you do your time, and that social contract for labor just doesn't work anymore. Like, I think the younger teachers don't believe that they can lead the life that is workable for them under that teaching contract. And then what they're being asked to do in the classroom is deviating more and more from teaching and learning than it was in the past. And that's because, at least in the US, there's so much of the social support systems that we've thrown into the traditional school system. So like in New York public schools during COVID, one of the things we realized was that the public school system here is a school lunch program. So the only meal, there's like 100,000 kids in New York City where potentially the only meal that they're going to get for the day is the school lunch that they get. And so the public school system is doing a lot more than just schooling. And I think that what that means is for parents that are expecting excellence or they're expecting a high level of performance from the school system, are looking for like more alternative options so that they can get a good return on the investment of their child's time in the classroom.
Okay. And are there particular parts of alternative education that you're more excited about than others?
Well, as an investor, I'm more excited about the platforms and the tooling that can enable a ecosystem where parents and students get a lot of choice and where you can personalize education experiences to a student and offer them the best experience for what their goals are and what they want to learn. That's what's most interesting to me.
And long term, how do you see this evolve? Do you see these systems, kind of the system of kind of traditional education, sitting alongside a choice of different alternative education? Do you eventually see these various options overtaking the traditional system entirely? How do you think about this?
I don't think, at least immediately, the public system is going away because it is that sort of safety net, or that it should be a high floor or like a high bar. But it's hard to see with our institutional dysfunction in so many places that you're not going to chip away at that school system. So the data just came out, I think early last week, that school districts across America, public school districts, have seen unprecedented drops of enrollment. And a lot of the funding for public schools comes on a per pupil basis. So the schools are going to just have less resources, and slowly that's going to move to alternative providers, and that might happen. We think it's going to happen faster than many people realize right now.
And when you say faster than many people realize, like, how do you have any idea of quantification around this? Like, how big of a market do you think is being created here? How do you think about the speed and the opportunity that this creates?
I think you look at in the U.S. at what state policies are, and so what we've seen is at least 7 states in this past year adopt education savings accounts or like voucher programs for funding to go to direct to pupil. And so Arizona was one of the earliest adopters of this, and I think had a very big and successful voucher program launch this year. I know that Idaho also launched like a direct to parent subsidy program. I believe West Virginia had one, and then it was like disputed by the courts. I think Florida has had one for a while. And so I think you see the proliferation of these programs, and you see the legislation moving through state legislators. And so the more that happens, the bigger the market gets for alternative providers. I think the other thing, and then so that's like the top down from the government coming to the parents. From the bottom up, I think you're seeing a lot of particularly wealthy or minority parents that are just buying out of pocket supplemental education or alternatives, and like that direct to consumer education market is getting bigger and bigger. So for example, the way we see this impacting investments is one of the first investments in Avalanche was a company called Prisms of Reality, which is a math curriculum using virtual reality, which of course is very pertinent to what we're doing today. And they, I think, have over 100,000 student licenses that they sold in the past 2 years, and they're in like 32 states. And then they are launching on the Oculus MetaQuest store direct to consumer in a couple of weeks. So you're seeing curriculum that traditionally you'd only get in a traditional classroom that now you can access at home, or you can access for your pod, your micro school or your pod. And I think that like Prisms of Reality is just the first to market. And they want to have a whole library that covers this, like all the different math components and maybe science and engineering. And so then that is going to open up people's imagination to what a more alternative future could look like, to be able to personalize the experience for an individual student.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You touched on these so education savings accounts, which you also mentioned in the article that you wrote. I found that a really interesting concept, and for some weird reason hadn't actually properly come across it before. Can you explain a little bit more what they are about and why you think they're such a big thing?
Yeah, so they're basically like a government saying to a parent, here is, there's the devil is in the details on all of these programs. There are like a ton of rules and definitions, and like special ed kids might get more, or different grade levels get more or less. So let's just like a simple example is if you have a first grader, the government of Arizona might say, here's $5,000 for you to be able to use to purchase education options from these accredited providers, and you can choose from this list about how you spend that. So if that is choosing between 3 different kindergarten programs that are in your city, or maybe it's buying some Prisms of Reality math curriculum, or having this special like learning reading learning app that's available on the Apple Store. The government will put that money in your wallet, and then you can choose to direct that to where you see fit.
It's very interesting. So I can imagine this gives more agency to the individual, to the consumer directly, to direct the funds that the way they want them to be directed, rather than it kind of coming from a school system, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's where you're saying that that's the part that leads to a stronger consumer, or at least part of the trend that kind of leads to a stronger consumer market, because those funds are getting directed by the people directly rather than by institutions and governments.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think it gets to like the notion of, one of the things I think our society hasn't yet come to terms with is that the school system used to act in loco parentis, like in the place of parents, right? They're like, okay, so every student is mandated to go to this public school system, and we're going to make sure that everyone like learns to read and learns mathematics, and so that there's some sorts of standardization. And because school systems have, for a whole wide variety of reasons, like failed to deliver on those promises, we're now giving the decision making back to parents. And one of the things that we haven't yet like come to a solution for is for students or young people whose parents are not able for whatever reason to act in the role of making those appropriate choices for their kids. Like, how do you still ensure that every child is able to read and has an access to high quality of education?
It's a very, very interesting developments. And so we talked a lot about kind of the general school system here, and I guess it was more kind of a focus on the younger years. Is there, when you think about alternative education, how do you think about this more in a workforce environment? Is that even a thing? Like, yeah, how do you think through that?
I think it's huge. I think it's sort of one of the biggest things, because in the US, and I think the UK is similar, over the last 20 years has been the proliferation of these like super expensive master's degrees programs that are often like, you leave the job, you go to do your master's for 2 years, and you come back and you believe that you're going to get this higher salary. And what we now know in the workplace and in our lives is that the pace of technological development is happening so fast, and so much of the skills and the tools that you need to learn are embedded in the jobs. So you can't, like, it doesn't make sense to just leave the workforce for 2 years and then come back to it. And instead, you have to almost think that, like, if I'm going to be an effective employee or freelancer, or like adding value to my industry, I need to probably spend at least 20% of my time upgrading myself on the trends, the tools, the networks and relationships that are going to help me stay competitive and at the cutting edge, because it's really easy to like fall behind.
Yeah. Very interesting. And right now, I mean, historically speaking, this has been often in the realm of the employer providing, or at least it was, yeah, the employer providing various programs, or the employee having to basically stop for a year or two,
Right.
getting their degree and coming back. How do you see this space change if you have to spend 20% of your time or whatever percentage of your time kind of to stay up to date with what is coming through while you're in work? What are the types of learning environments that would be appropriate for that?
Well, I think continuous education is really important. So, one of the trends in for adult learning is that we have this theme at Avalanche called "Everyone is an Entrepreneur," and or like the rise of the freelancer. Is I just think you see much more like contract labor, or people who are using their skills to and basically have maybe a couple different clients or a couple different companies that they're working for at the same time. Or if they are employed by a company, it might be it's less time than it was before, right? Like the average tenure for a job 20 years ago was 10 years, and now it's like 3 years, and it's like decreasing every year, right? Like people don't expect to be in the job for their whole be at the same employer for their whole career. And so that means that they need to be either investing themselves and constantly upskilling themselves so that they can demonstrate that they have these skills to their employers or the people that they are contracting they're like lending out their talent to, or employers, if they really want to keep the same workforce, are going to need to be able to use learning and development and progression in the seat as a way of motivating and retaining talent.
And have you seen any companies or any approaches that have made significant headway in this, kind of compared to just another LMS somewhere that a company puts in front of the workforce? Like anything that you're particularly excited by in this space that is making a difference?
I think there's some companies, like we've invested in a company called Curious in Latin America, but I think they're very similar model to Reforge in the US, where basically like it's a B2B model. They sell to an employer to help digitally upskill existing staff. So like helping them be product managers or digital marketing managers, and the instructors are people who've worked at technology, like fast growing technology startups in those roles, and the curriculum is really like tailored to help people be successful in the job that they're currently at with the new sort of like skill set. I think the other thing that we've seen be really successful is the best in class SaaS products or like workplace tools have embedded education. So you take Figma, for example, the design software, and built into Figma are a set of modules about how to use the tool to be a better collaborative designer. So you're learning design with learning the tool with, and Figma is a multiplayer design tool, right? So you're probably doing it, building the designs with other team members, and that peer group helps reinforce your learning. Sometimes it's like you see people in job interviews or when you talk to people and they're like, if it's a designer and they talk about using, like for me, it's like Adobe, and they're like, Figma, never heard of Figma. You're like, uh-oh, like this isn't going to work out,
Yeah, if you haven't heard
it's
of
almost
Figma
that stark.
today, and so yeah, true. Yeah, very, very true. So interesting I guess half segue at least in my head, because I've been thinking about AI quite a bit in the last few months, and one of the projects I looked at was automated Figma design creation based on text prompts, which is interesting. You now have Figma plugins that take text prompts in order to create designs to start with, basically going over whatever the first creation bit is. It's like the blank page problem for designers, basically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just one example, but I imagine you've been following all the stuff around ChatGPT, Midjourney, all of the things that have kind of been coming out. Like, first off, were you expecting this? So, like, if a month and a half ago I would have asked you this question, like, would you have thought this was coming? And then second, like, has your thinking changed in the last month, and how you think about artificial intelligence in learning through a practical lens of like 2023 and 2024, not like 2030?
I'd say no. It's funny because I wrote this blog in 2020 when the last iteration of Chat or of GPT, was it GPT-2? I thought it was still called GPT-3 back then, came out, and there was a lot of like hype and excitement around it. Yeah. So, like it was obvious to me then that it was coming out. I think what has been interesting about it in the last 6 weeks is how much more it seems to have penetrated the common person, at least in my like Twitter social circle or Substacks that I subscribe to, like like how much it's like infiltrated their like thinking and excitement. And now it's, New York Public Schools has come out and said that they're banning GPT. And so it seems like it's hit another, because the technology's and it's going up an exponential curve, right? It's not a linear step function in terms of how good the technology is going to be. So it's now hit a much bigger like penetration in society. And so I think seeing that happen has been interesting and surprising. I think that in some ways it's the same as it's ever been in terms of education, which is like, if people want to cheat, they're going to cheat and find ways to do it. They're either going to like look over the smart kid's like shoulder and copy his answers, or they're going to like go to Chat GPT and type in some prompts to get to an answer. And the person that you're really cheating is yourself. And so I think it puts the onus on educators and adults and societies to have better pedagogical tools and solutions and reasons for why young people and people in general should invest in their learning for learning's sake, because it makes them, better. It makes their life more meaningful. It means that they can understand the world in a more intense way. It gives them a skill to, be more creative and think deeper about who they are. And so I think it increases the onus on educators and societies to improve. And I always think that it's a real shame when there's just that knee-jerk reaction to want to clamp down on something new because it seems scary, instead of stepping back and using judgment and nuance to think, well, how can we modify what we're doing to make this successful? And it's funny because that's actually the biggest risk in society, is that people are no longer able to use judgment. Like, I was at a restaurant in Brooklyn on Saturday night with a friend, and we wanted to get a table, and it looked like in the restaurant there were like 5 empty tables, and the hostess was like looking at the the screen and trying to
it's like there are no tables.
Figure out like when people were coming and could we sit down. I mean, and she was like, it looked like her brain was about to explode, and it must have been like it was a very long, like 3 or 4 minutes, when she was just like, yeah, I don't know, maybe can you come back and I'll take down, and we were like, do you want to take down our phone number? And it was almost like she couldn't do any like thinking by herself.
Is an over reliance on the system, and when the system doesn't give you the direct answer or doesn't make sense, then you can no longer think for yourself. That type of
Correct.
behavior.
Yeah.
It's
And
a
you don't
really
like trust yourself anymore, right? You're like, well, I don't want to make a mistake
Yeah.
here, and I can't understand exactly what's going on into the system. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's a really interesting relationship between machines and humans in that way. I was surprised by one of the people that I work with at some point, where when we were talking about this, they kind of let slip at some point saying, now I finally feel comfortable commenting on great social posts. Because what they would do is feed the social post into ChatGPT and ask it for an interesting question.
oh, interesting.
Because they were afraid to sound stupid, which stopped them from asking the question in the first place in a public forum.
Yeah.
And it really made me think, because, I mean, on the one hand, there's value in the fact the question is now asked, and somebody still thought about, well, not about how to ask the question, but thought about the question they asked. They will have likely read the question, and it'll get to a result of maybe even a discussion that comes from the question. But the act of thinking about the question, thinking about the problem, and figuring out what an interesting question could be for themselves gets lost in that transaction. So I'm not sure where I land in terms of net positive or negative in that type of interaction. One of the biggest things that was interesting for me was the definition of what learning looks like seems to, or at least in my opinion right now, has shifted somewhat. Just like the calculator changed the way that we think about mathematics, like you still need to understand how to add and subtract and multiply, but most of the learning happens at a conceptual level of understanding what addition is, understanding what subtraction is, and multiplication, and then being able to use those concepts rather than just blindly doing them over and over, because the reality is you can use a calculator. And I wonder how much of that translates to so many more fields now with this new technology being present, with this tool being there. Just like we use Google in any of the presentations today, and that's totally accepted, that you find your stuff on the internet and then evaluate it and use it. This helps you write better, helps you ask questions better, helps you refine your thoughts, iterate your thoughts. Even I wonder how much it can influence your entire thinking model, which I guess is both good and bad, depending on how which way it nudges you in terms of thinking.
Yeah, like, are people going to think much more consensus, right? Like, is it going to be much harder to both emotionally and to be accepted for having independent thinking or contrarian views, or you know?
Yeah, it'll be
like,
very
so much
interesting.
when I use ChatGPT, it's so derivative, by definition it's derivative, right?
So it is an interesting one. So I agree. I have found if you tweak what you ask it, you can specifically make it non-derivative. You can specifically ask it to take a contrarian view. You can specifically ask it to give you a view that is non-mainstream, and it will actually dig into those things and get you very different answers. Which the default doesn't, because, to your point, by definition, it'll just give you the average. But again, this is a very interesting discussion on its own, right? Because the value of asking great questions, and great being defined as in a question that leads to a great answer from an artificial intelligence is very interesting, because the quality of your interaction model with that artificial intelligence directly determines the value you can extract from it. So yeah, it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit.
That is
Personally,
interesting.
personally I am very bullish on just how much this is changing things right now. So probably even more than than you would be today. But it's a very interesting space. So as we talk about these various models of learning and education, there is a very standardized way of testing and quantifying things today, at least in the traditional system. How do you think the models of quantification and measurement have to evolve as more and more different ways of learning emerge?
Like measuring learning outcomes, or you mean like the
Learning outcomes and skills, and how do you how as we have different paths to learning, different modes, different models, how do we ensure quality? How do we measure what someone has learned in a way that allows a conversation about the level of skill that somebody has built up over time, that still makes sense to two people around the table, an employer and an employee, for example? When there are 500 different models of learning, how do you have that conversation in a way where people are talking the same language?
Oh, I think that's really tough, and I think that's something that I think that's the biggest unanswered question right now that people are trying to figure out. And I think that there's going to be a lot of diversity out there in terms of like what people want to see and how they operate. I think even I was talking to a friend this weekend who's a senior staff engineer at a big technology company, and they were saying to me they were trying to interview for like a series, like a hot Series A startup, and that that this person didn't get the job, and maybe one of the reasons was that the company had hired 2 engineers from her previous employer, and they didn't work out for whatever reason. And so, maybe there was something in the way that like the engineers at that one tech company like didn't work as well, didn't understand the systems, or didn't work as well in the environment with, engineers who were primarily from like a different big technology company. And so it's interesting how even within something that you think would be very black and white or straightforward, there are all these nuances in terms of like ways of working and ways that people and skills that people have that really matter for teams. And so I think that it's like almost impossible to generalize because people are now so specialized.
Yeah, it is a really it is a difficult question to answer. How much do you think the success of alternative education solutions will depend on there being an answer, though? If you don't have a way to showcase or to have your value of your learning valued on the other end, how much will that have an impact on the demand for alternative education?
Well, I think the vertical labor marketplaces, like where people hire and how they hire, gives a very transparent answer into that sort of thing.
So can
in
you
terms of
expand
the
on that a
skills.
little bit?
So like if you're a freelance graphic designer and you're on Upwork, like the portfolio that you have and the like ratings that you have are probably like a big way that you're going to be judged about whether people are going to hire you. And that's true even if you're on Upwork, or if you say you're even like a local like service contractor, and you're like an arborist in Wisconsin, and people are going to go on Google and like look at your reviews and decide between you and maybe some other competitor on a couple of like criteria and choose,
Yeah.
right? And so I think those marketplaces give visibility when people are especially like solo entrepreneurs or micro businesses, like marketing themselves almost constantly for jobs, or for business. And then when it comes to em- employability at bigger companies or maybe more like white collar jobs, referrals and networks really matter. Like being a known commodity matters. And I think that people also need to like you want to kind of like find your home, and that home might be small too. So it's like a matching on both sides.
Yeah, so more of a marketplace portfolio-based evaluation type mechanic over time.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I think we are approximately at the end of the questions that I had here. So there's one other question I asked you to think about for the end, which was, what is the biggest question that you have today that you are trying to find an answer to, that you would like to find an answer to, but you don't have yet?
Yeah. Yeah, so I gave this some thought, and I think one of the biggest questions for me, and it relates to these AI models, language learning models, is like who owns them, and where will the economics go? So, is something like OpenAI going to be this centralized model that every company then has to pay subscriptions to get access to plug into applications, and then are like does the application layer not have a moat, or have like a much like smaller moat around what they're building, because they're always reliant on the person or the organization that owns the like massive well performing AI model. And so then you're like, whoever gets to use OpenAI's models first will have a first mover advantage and be able to like get all the customers, and they will like, you know, not have a moat around like a business that is worth investing in. I mean, I think we think about that a lot because we're seeing a bunch of content companies in education be like, oh, we've plugged in an AI model into to be able to create automated content that is personalized to what kids are interested in learning. And so that's going to help them like read or write better. And my question always like, well, why couldn't like 15 other organizations do the same thing? Because they can just also pay OpenAI for the model and like type in some prompts, like what's the proprietary piece that the application layer has besides like being first to market or, slightly better UX UI.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question indeed. I'm hoping it's going to go towards the kind of an AWS type model where it becomes commoditized and basically becomes part of the infrastructure layer, and everyone gets access to it all the time. That is what OpenAI was supposed to be about, right? And it's about opening the access to everyone instead of having this in the hands of the Googles or the Facebooks of the world,
Right.
that would
But
have
it's
had
owned
a
by Microsoft, right? And there's definitely
yeah.
some people getting
I
access
know
to it faster than others. So
it's definitely going to be an interesting one to see how close to their original mission they end up at, and if they don't, how quickly the open source model might look at. Like if you look
yeah,
at what happened with Midjourney, that was very interesting, right? Midjourney proprietary, but then Stable Diffusion came out initially nowhere near as good, but very quickly caught up. And now you have
yeah,
Stable Diffusion models that were trained on great Midjourney images, which actually produce very, very high quality images as well. So yeah, it's a very new, very interesting space. Good question. I wish I had the
yes.
answer as well.
Well, hopefully by the end of 3 months or so, we can compare
Yes,
notes and see if we have better thoughts.
exactly. So, with all of these questions, were you able to spot the ChatGPT question?
Was it the assessment one?
It was not.
Oh,
It It was the question of if you think alternative education will eventually take over the entire education system or live alongside it.
Okay, cool.
Obviously,
There
I'm
you go.
skewing it to my favorite because I asked it to generate a few questions, and I took the one that I thought was most interesting. So obviously that kind of comes with it. But yeah,
So there was some
um,
curation there.
oh,
Human
there was,
curation.
and it was also prompt based, right? So I fed it your
Right.
article. I then very specifically asked it to create a thoughtful but divisive question.
Ooh.
Yeah. So, and this is again where like the prompt makes a very big difference in terms of
Yeah.
the results that you get back. Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. How was it for you as well for the first time this long in VR, I guess?
Yeah, no, it was great. It's a new medium, and as I said, I love learning, and so it's also thrilling to like kind of learn a new skill. And as we're doing this, it has prompted me to think, well, maybe I should be using this in different ways, or I wonder if we can do, maybe we should have our Avalanche like team meetings in VR.
It's hey, if you're investing in VR, might as well spend a decent amount of
Yeah,
time in it.
yeah, true. I think that's a
Cool.
really good point. Thanks for asking me and the prompt, and this has been wonderful.
Yeah, same. Thank you very much, and have a great day then.
Thanks. You too. Bye, Josh.
Bye.
I'm your host, Joshua Vola, CEO at Mindstone, and I hope today's conversation shed light on at least some of the problems we're facing. If you thought today's conversation was interesting, I invite you to subscribe to our podcast by searching for #AskWhy in your favorite podcast app, or follow us on YouTube or TikTok and catch the video feed of these conversations, which are happening in VR.